The billionaire's autistic father couldn't sleep with the lights off until the maid. He was a man worth billions. But even all the money in the world couldn't help him understand the one person who needed him most, his father. Elias, an elderly man with autism, hadn't slept in the dark for decades. Every night, every room, every hallway, lights on always. Most thought it was just stubbornness, maybe even madness. But they were wrong. Something deeper was hiding in the silence. Something that no one ever bothered to ask about. Until she arrived, a maid with no wealth, no title, just patience, presence, and the courage to listen. What she discovered didn't just change how Elias slept. It changed everything. What was Elias truly afraid of? Why did the darkness hold him hostage? The answer will break your heart and open your eyes. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach across the world. This is another touching tale from Mr. Edward's Tales, where real emotion lives and stories make you reflect on life. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video, because when you stop doing this, YouTube understands that you don't like this content and stops recommending good stories like this. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard's mansion was a place of quiet wealth, but the one room that never rested in darkness belonged to Elias, his 78-year-old father. Every night, while the rest of the house dimmed into a calm, sterile sleep, that single door at the end of the corridor remained flooded with light. Inside, Elias sat awake in his bed, fully dressed except for his shoes, staring at nothing in particular, his fingers tapping an invisible rhythm against his knees. The staff whispered about him. He's losing it. Old age. He can't stand silence. None dared to say it to Richard, of course. He provided them all with good salaries and clear instructions. Do what he asks, don't argue. Still, whispers carried further than light. Elias wasn't deaf to them, and every careless word seemed to chip away a little more of his dignity. He didn't understand the mockery entirely, but he could feel it. The weight of being tolerated, not respected. When the last maid left his room each night, he waited until the sound of her footsteps disappeared before whispering to the empty air, "I'm still here, you know." It was a statement, a reassurance, maybe even a warning to the ghosts of memory that crowded the edges of his mind. Richard rarely entered that room anymore. He told himself it was because his father preferred solitude, but deep down he feared the discomfort of being reminded of fragility, of time. To him, Elias's rituals were a sign of decay, not pain. "He's safe," Richard would tell himself while checking his phone. "He has care, medicine, everything." But care without understanding is just another form of neglect. When Richard was a boy, Elias had been strict, organized, almost mechanical in his ways. Never cruel, but never soft either. The irony was not lost on Richard. The man who once demanded order now lived inside a chaos of his own mind. Yet, even chaos had rules. The lights had to stay on, always. The few times Richard tried to reason with him, Elias grew agitated, his voice trembling between fury and panic. "Don't touch the switch," he would bark, his tone sharper than any old man's voice had a right to be. Richard would retreat, muttering something about stubbornness, and leave, letting the brightness spill into the hallway like an accusation. The staff had grown accustomed to the strange nightly glow. New hires learned quickly, don't question the old man, just leave the lamps, the chandelier, even the bathroom light if he asks. One night, a new cleaner, unaware of the unspoken rule, turned off the bedside lamp while dusting. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. Elias screamed, not in anger but in sheer, primal fear, the kind that doesn't belong to logic or age. The lamp shattered as he flailed, knocking it off the table. The cleaner stumbled back, pale and shaking, and within hours she had quit. Richard had paid her severance without comment. What could he say? How do you explain that the light wasn't about habit? It was survival. Since that day, no one questioned the ritual again. Elias never apologized. He didn't have the words for that kind of shame. In his world, apologies were slippery things. He understood safety better than regret, and safety to him was brightness. At dinner, Richard sometimes tried to bring up the subject, usually after his second glass of wine. "You know, Dad, electricity isn't free," he'd say half-jokingly, waiting for some spark of humor in return. Elias would simply glance at him, confused, his fork paused mid-air. "You can afford it," he'd answer quietly, his tone completely devoid of irony. That answer always ended the conversation. Richard would sigh, look away, and remind himself that arguing with his father was like arguing with weather, pointless, inevitable, and exhausting. Yet after every failed attempt, a strange thought crept into his mind. Maybe Elias was right. Maybe money was the only thing Richard could offer him now. Light without warmth, care without love. Still, something in Elias's expression during those dinners unsettled him. Behind the clouded eyes, there was something unbroken, something watching, as if Elias knew far more than he ever said. The nights were the worst for Elias, but also the most predictable. As the clock approached 10, he performed his quiet checklist, door unlocked, light switches on, one by one, the rhythm precise, almost ceremonial. Sometimes he spoke under his breath, rehearsing names that no longer had faces. Margaret, Thomas, stay with me. No one knew who they were. When he finally sat down, surrounded by the artificial glow, his breathing slowed, his eyes darting from one corner to another, as if confirming that no shadow dared move. The light didn't make him happy, but it made him less afraid, and for Elias, that was enough. His mind, still sharp in some corners, refused to rest. Sleep was a trickster. It brought the dark whether he liked it or not. So he fought it the only way he could, with light, with presence, with vigilance. Sometimes, when the night was long enough and the air in his room felt still, Elias imagined he could hear footsteps from decades ago. The heavy boots of someone closing a door that should have stayed open, the click of a light switch sealing him inside some forgotten memory. He never spoke of it, not even to Richard. Words couldn't reach that far back. The fear wasn't a memory, it was muscle, bone, instinct. When dawn came and the first sliver of sunlight entered his room, Elias finally exhaled, whispering, "See, I made it again." Outside, the mansion woke to another day, and the staff passed by his open door, whispering as always about the man who sleeps with the lights on. They never realized the truth, that Elias didn't keep the lights to see, but to be seen. For him, brightness wasn't about comfort. It was about proof that he still existed. Richard had built his life around the idea that success would justify distance. His entire adult existence was an exercise in control. Meetings, deadlines, acquisitions, a schedule so full that it left no room for silence or sentiment. He liked to believe that efficiency was love in disguise. Providing was the same as caring. When people asked about his father, he would say, "He's fine, I take care of him," as if a monthly doctor's visit and the best caregiver's money could buy could substitute for time. In truth, he avoided Elias because the old man mirrored everything Richard refused to confront: fragility, regret, and the past. Their conversations had shrunk to fragments of practicality. "Do you need anything?" "No." "All right, rest well." A ritual of emptiness performed nightly. Once a colleague asked why he didn't just hire a private facility. "He'd hate it," Richard replied quickly, though he wasn't sure if that was compassion or guilt speaking. Deep down, he feared that if he sent Elias away, the silence of the house would become unbearable. Having him nearby allowed Richard to pretend he was still a good son, even if he was never really present. Elias, on the other hand, had stopped expecting visits long ago. He had learned to measure Richard's affection in gestures that required no words. The food always stocked, the bills paid, the checkups scheduled. Gratitude came out awkwardly, in half-mumbled sentences like, "You've done enough," or "I know you're busy." But sometimes, when Richard walked past his open door without looking in, something inside Elias would clench. He didn't have the vocabulary to express loneliness in a way that didn't sound like complaint, so he said nothing. Instead, he waited until the house grew quiet and whispered into the brightness of his room, "He used to sit here when he was small." The words weren't meant for anyone, just fragments of memory he refused to lose. He remembered Richard as a child, curious, talkative, sensitive to light, always asking questions about the world. That boy had once sat on the edge of his bed, asking why the night seemed so long. Elias had told him then, because it waits for the things we don't want to face. Now, decades later, it was Richard who refused to face his father's night. For Richard, work was an armor that kept him from falling apart. His secretary once joked that he didn't know how to rest. "Rest is a form of surrender," he'd replied without humor. Every deal he closed, every new property he acquired, became another wall between him and what remained of family. Sometimes, though, he caught himself wondering if Elias was even aware of how distant he had become. On rare mornings, he'd pass his father sitting by the window, sipping tea with both hands wrapped around the cup, as if it was something fragile. "Morning, Dad," he'd say, half in motion, already looking at his phone. Elias would respond softly, "You're leaving early again, not as a question but as a fact." Richard would nod, "Big day ahead," and that was that. Once Elias tried to ask, "Do you ever slow down?" Richard had chuckled without stopping, "Not if I can help it." That exchange stayed with Elias for hours afterward, not because of what was said, but because of how easily his son had vanished down the hallway, his presence dissolving like steam. At dinner, when they happened to sit together, silence dominated the table. Elias would eat slowly, each bite deliberate, while Richard scrolled through messages between sips of wine. "You work too much," Elias said one night. Richard didn't look up. "Someone has to," he replied, the tone halfway between pride and exhaustion. "For what?" Elias asked quietly. Richard hesitated. The question had no real answer, at least not one he wanted to admit. He worked to avoid stillness, to escape the quiet moments when the old man's eyes would meet his and force him to remember everything they had never said. "To keep things running," Richard muttered finally. Elias nodded, but said nothing more. That exchange lingered in Richard's mind longer than he wanted. For the rest of the evening, he found himself thinking about what keeping things running actually meant. The business was thriving, yes, but the house felt dead. There was no laughter, no noise, just the faint hum of lights, his father's lights, burning endlessly down the corridor. Sometimes the staff tried to bridge the gap between father and son, though never successfully. The butler once suggested, "Mr. Richard, your father asks for you when he's agitated. Maybe spending a few minutes with him at night might help." Richard dismissed it politely. "He's fine when the lights are on." But one night, returning home late, he heard his father talking, not mumbling, but speaking clearly, as if to someone invisible. Richard stood outside the door, listening. "They think I don't notice," Elias said softly, "but I do. Every time the door closes, I count how long until I hear it open again." His voice cracked on the word, "again." Richard froze. For a moment, guilt burned in his chest, but pride smothered it quickly. He told himself it was just confusion, an old man talking to the air. Still, he walked away slower than usual that night. Something about his father's words lingered like static in his mind. He didn't know it, but that was the first time in years he'd stopped to actually hear Elias. And what he heard unsettled him deeply. Yet despite that brief pang of awareness, nothing changed. Richard's habits were too ingrained, his routines too polished to break. The next morning he left before sunrise, leaving behind another note on the kitchen counter. "Have breakfast. Call me if you need anything." Elias found it hours later and placed it on the bedside table beside a small lamp. He read it 3 times, his lips moving silently over the same words until they lost meaning. Then he turned on every light in the room, one switch after another until the space glowed. Sitting on the bed, he whispered to himself, "He doesn't see what I'm afraid of." For Elias, the brightness was not just light, it was the only language he had left to say, "I'm still here, waiting." And for Richard, far away in a meeting room, his father's fears remained invisible, hidden beneath the fluorescent calm of a world that rewarded distance and punished emotion. After the abrupt resignation of the last caregiver, the 4th one in less than a year, Richard made the call without much hope. He no longer expected anyone to last more than a few weeks with Elias. The agency promised someone gentle, attentive, with strong emotional intelligence. He barely glanced at the resume. He just said, "Send her tomorrow." The next morning, Amara arrived. She was calm, warm-voiced, and confident without being overbearing. When Richard met her, he kept the introduction brief, giving her a list of responsibilities with the same cold efficiency he gave his business team. "He's stubborn, keeps the lights on. You'll figure it out," he said, eyes already on his phone. Amara just nodded, but she noticed the detachment immediately. Her response was simple. Understood. She didn't need stories. She read between silences. As Richard turned away, Amara remained still for a second longer than expected, watching the hallway he disappeared into. Then she picked up her small duffel bag and walked quietly toward the room at the end of the corridor, where her work, and something far more human, was waiting. The first time Elias saw her, he didn't react much. He was sitting upright in his bed, his fingers tapping steadily against his thigh, a rhythm Amara instinctively noted, without comment. She greeted him gently. "Good morning, Mr. Elias. I'm Amara. I'll be helping around." His eyes flickered toward her but didn't linger. That didn't bother her. Most caregivers tried to force connection on the first day. Smiles too wide, voices too loud, instructions too direct. Amara did none of that. She didn't rush to rearrange his routines. Instead, she walked the room slowly, observing what he had already set for himself, the order of the pillows, the switches he had taped over to prevent accidental darkness, the way his slippers were always lined perfectly at the foot of the bed. She dusted shelves silently, moved nothing out of place, and only spoke when it was clear he was paying attention. "You like tea in the evening or the morning?" she asked once. Elias shrugged, then finally answered, "Evening, no sugar." That was it. Their first real exchange, small but meaningful. Other staff noticed the difference within a few days. Amara didn't push Elias to speak, but he began responding to her presence more than he ever had with others. She started using patterns he found comforting, always knocking twice before entering, announcing every movement with a short sentence. "I'm going to open the window," or "I'm placing your tea on the tray now." These phrases anchored Elias. He didn't show gratitude, not in words, but he began watching her as she moved through the room, not out of suspicion, but recognition. One evening, as she adjusted the position of a floor lamp, she asked gently, "Do you prefer it facing this way?" Elias paused, then nodded. It was the first time in years he had been asked about his preferences as something that mattered. That same night, as Amara prepared the room for bedtime, she instinctively reached for one of the switches. The gesture was slow, habitual, part of the process she assumed she had earned the trust for. But in the instant her fingers neared the switch, everything changed. Elias's reaction was immediate and devastating. His voice erupted from somewhere primal. "No!" His hands flew up as if shielding himself from an incoming blow, and his body recoiled violently toward the wall. The terror wasn't theatrical. It was raw, unfiltered panic. Amara froze in place, her hand still hovering near the switch, her eyes wide but calm. Elias's breathing had become erratic, his entire body curling into itself like a man preparing to vanish. "Please don't," he whispered, voice cracking. "Please." The words weren't directed at her. They were directed at something older than her presence, something she couldn't yet see. Amara stepped away from the switch slowly, making sure her movements were visible. She said nothing, not even an apology. Instead, she walked quietly to the side of the bed and sat down without asking. Elias's eyes flicked toward her, not with trust, but with disbelief. She didn't reach for him. She didn't explain herself. She simply sat and waited. Minutes passed. His breathing slowed. His fingers stopped shaking. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't the suffocating kind. Elias began to uncurl, just slightly, his legs stretching out again beneath the blanket. Amara remained where she was, her back straight, her expression unreadable but undeniably present. Most caregivers would have left, excused themselves with shame or embarrassment, blaming the man or their own discomfort. But Amara understood something crucial in that moment. Elias wasn't protecting his routine, he was surviving it. That light was not a preference. It was a shield. When she finally spoke again, her voice was soft but sure. "I won't touch it again unless you tell me to." Elias didn't respond, but the next time she entered the room, he didn't turn away. And the next night, when she sat beside him again, he didn't flinch. That unspoken agreement, no forcing, no explaining, became the foundation of something real. That night, Elias fell asleep with all the lights on, as he always did. But for the first time in years, someone sat beside him and didn't try to fix him. She didn't scold. She didn't rationalize. She didn't treat his fear like a malfunction to be reprogrammed. Instead, she simply stayed, quiet and still, acknowledging without judgment that the dark meant something she didn't yet understand. Elias drifted to sleep more slowly than usual, but with fewer twitches in his hands, fewer glances at the corners of the room. As Amara remained seated at the edge of his bed, watching him with care, but without intrusion, the panic that usually clung to the edges of his sleep loosened its grip. And as the hours passed, the brightness of the room did not feel clinical or excessive. It felt earned. Amara didn't speak again that night. She didn't have to. Her presence said everything Elias had needed to hear for decades. Amara had worked with vulnerable people before. Children with trauma, elderly patients with dementia, even adults lost inside their own minds. But there was something different about Elias. His rituals were not born of confusion, but precision. His insistence on light wasn't chaotic, but deliberate. Structured like a wall, he rebuilt every night to keep something out. And the more she watched him, the more she understood. This wasn't habit. This was defense. The way he flinched when a shadow moved across the floor, how his eyes darted to corners even during conversation, how his body would stiffen if someone walked past the door too quickly. These were not quirks. They were scars reacting to invisible touch. Amara didn't ask questions right away. She simply noted, absorbed, and filed away details others ignored. Most of the staff had dismissed his behavior as senility, and even Richard, when she brought it up, was quick to shut the door. "He's always been like that," he said casually, barely looking up from his tablet. "He just hates the dark." But there was no curiosity behind his words, only exhaustion. Amara's jaw tightened. "Do you know why?" she asked. Richard scoffed. "I don't need to. He's my father, not a patient." Amara didn't argue. She knew battles were won with persistence, not confrontation. That evening, instead of helping Elias prepare for bed the way she usually did, she pulled a chair closer to him and asked gently, "Did you always sleep with the lights on?" Elias didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the lamp beside his bed, blinking as if trying to memorize its brightness. Silence stretched, but Amara didn't move. She didn't repeat the question. Instead, she sat still, letting him set the pace. Minutes passed. He tapped his fingers twice against his thigh. a pattern she'd come to recognize, before finally whispering, "You ask a lot." Amara smiled, but didn't respond with another question. She only said, "You don't have to answer anything you don't want to." That made Elias glance at her, and something in his face, a flicker of surprise, maybe even relief, told her she had said the right thing. That night, after he fell asleep, she sat a little longer beside him, wondering what darkness he had seen in his past that still held him captive in his old age. In the days that followed, she tried again, not always directly and never forcefully. Sometimes it was through shared routines. You ever like reading in the dark, or always preferred the light? Sometimes through stories of her own. My little brother couldn't sleep unless the closet light was on. He said it kept the monsters away. Elias would give no reaction, or at most a grunt, but she saw it. The tension in his shoulders would shift, the rhythm of his tapping would slow. It was working. Not fast, not loud, but real. One afternoon, as she folded his clean shirts, she tried something new. "If I'm honest," she said, "sometimes silence scares me more than noise, makes me think I've disappeared." For the first time, Elias spoke without being prompted. "You're still there," he said, just those 3 words. Amara turned her head slowly, surprised, and met his eyes. "So are you," she answered. He looked away, but she didn't miss the way his fingers stopped moving completely for several seconds. That was all the confirmation she needed. Elias wasn't unreachable. He was just tired of shouting into rooms where no one ever listened. Then came the moment that defined everything. It was an evening like any other. Tea at 7, the checklist of light switches at 8:30, bedtime preparations at 9. Amara was brushing off the collar of his shirt when she noticed he had stopped tapping. His hands were still, resting on his lap. She crouched slightly to meet his gaze and asked, "Do the lights help you feel safe?" Elias didn't answer. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his breathing grew shallow. Amara was about to back off when he whispered, "They keep me here." She didn't understand at first. "Here where?" she asked gently. His eyes, usually flickering, fixed on hers. And then, with a voice so soft she had to lean in to hear it, he said, "When the lights go out. It's like I disappear." The words were not dramatic. They weren't even emotional. But they hit with the weight of decades. Elias wasn't speaking metaphorically. To him, the dark wasn't just the absence of light. It was the erasure of self. As if the world could forget he ever existed if he couldn't see himself inside it. Amara sat down beside him without speaking again. She didn't ask what had caused it. Not yet. She didn't need the whole history to understand the urgency of his fear. That single sentence explained everything. The panic, the rituals, the rage when someone touched a switch without permission. The light was his anchor to existence. A way to declare, "I am still here." Amara realized how devastating it must have been to live inside that kind of fear for years, maybe decades, and be surrounded by people who labeled it as eccentricity or stubbornness. No one had thought to ask him why the dark frightened him. They assumed it was childish, irrational, or symptomatic of old age. But Elias had known exactly what he was afraid of. Not shadows, not monsters, oblivion. That night when she helped him into bed, she didn't go through the checklist. She let him do it, and when he looked up at her before turning off the final lamp and hesitated, she touched his hand and said, "I'll stay until you fall asleep. I won't let you disappear." He nodded once. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw the faintest trace of peace settle across his face. That night ended with the same ritual it always did. Elias in bed, the lights blazing throughout the room, Amara sitting beside him in silence. But everything had changed. Because now she understood. The fear wasn't about light bulbs or lamps. It was about being seen, being held in the fabric of the world when everything else fell away. Amara didn't speak. She didn't need to. Elias already knew she had heard him. And maybe that was what he had been waiting for all this time. Not for someone to fix him, but for someone to see the outline of his fear and say, I don't think it's silly. I think it makes sense. As she sat there, listening to his breath even out into sleep, Amara knew that nothing had been solved. But something had begun, and in that beginning there was light. Not the kind that filled a room, but the kind that let a person finally believe they weren't invisible anymore. Elias did not talk about his past the way people usually do. There were no stories, no timelines, no names to organize memory into something digestible. What he shared came in fragments, flashes of emotion disguised as sentences, brief pauses that contained decades. Amara learned to listen not only to what he said, but to what trembled underneath. One night, while they sat in their now familiar silence, Elias began to speak without preamble. "They left me there," he murmured. His eyes were unfocused, his hands gripping the blanket like an anchor. Amara didn't interrupt. "Where?" she asked quietly. He blinked, as if trying to find the word. "A place for boys like me. They said I was difficult, too quiet, too strange." The word strange came out bitter, like a taste he could never wash away. Amara wanted to ask who they were, but she sensed that pressing would only make him retreat. Instead, she said softly, "That must have been hard." Elias laughed once, dry, sharp. Hard? No. Being hungry was hard. Being invisible, that was worse. It was the first time he had ever described himself with that word, and the way he said it made Amara's stomach tighten. As days passed, Elias's fragments began connecting into something resembling a story. He had been sent away at 12 after teachers complained he couldn't behave normally. His parents, overwhelmed and confused, were told it was for the best. A special institution, they called it. He remembered the long car ride, the window that wouldn't open, his mother's silence. "She didn't even say goodbye," he said one evening, his voice hollow. "She just nodded to the man and left." Amara swallowed hard. "Do you remember what the place was called?" Elias shook his head. "No names, only numbers. We were numbers." Then he looked at her with a sudden sharpness that startled her. "Do you know what they do to boys who cry?" Amara met his gaze, unflinching. "Tell me," she said. His expression softened, but his voice turned to a whisper. "They teach you not to." He paused for a long time before continuing. "They put you somewhere dark until you stop." Amara felt her throat tighten. "And did you stop?" she asked. Elias's lips trembled. "I learned to be very quiet." That night, she sat longer than usual, unable to leave him alone with that kind of silence. Over the following weeks, Amara pieced together the full memory, a puzzle missing half its pieces, but still vivid enough to wound. Elias had been locked in a storage room for what he thought was a night, but was likely longer. "There were no windows," he said once, "no sound, just the door. I could hear them on the other side laughing." He described trying to count the seconds to stay sane, tracing invisible shapes on the floor with his fingers. "At first, I shouted. Then I whispered. Then, nothing." When Amara asked how he got out, he shrugged. "Someone opened the door. I don't remember who. Maybe they forgot I was there." His tone carried no anger, only the exhaustion of someone who had outlived their own pain. Amara tried to steady her voice. "Did you tell anyone afterward?" He shook his head slowly. "No one listens to the strange boy. They just call him broken." It was then that Amara understood why darkness to Elias was not absence, but punishment. The dark had been his first prison, a place that erased him, taught him that the world continued perfectly fine without him in it. Each night, after these confessions, Amara felt herself growing quieter too. She stopped trying to fill silences with reassurance, stopped treating his trauma like something to be fixed. Instead, she gave him space to let words surface naturally, like air bubbles rising from deep water. One night, as he described the moment the door opened, the burst of light, the way it burned his eyes, he stopped mid-sentence. "They told me to be grateful," he said, his voice breaking. grateful for being let out. Amara blinked back tears. "You were a child," she said firmly. "You didn't deserve that." Elias didn't answer. His gaze drifted toward the lamp again. "I used to think that if I kept the light on long enough, maybe someone would come back for me." Amara reached out instinctively but hesitated. Then deliberately she placed her hand over his, not forcing, not guiding, just there. "Someone did," she said quietly. For a long moment neither spoke. The air between them felt fragile, sacred. It wasn't healing yet, but it was something closer to recognition. After that night, Amara noticed subtle changes. Elias began mentioning his past more freely, not to relive it, but to reclaim it. He would point out details as if rebuilding pieces of himself, the smell of disinfectant in the halls, the way footsteps echoed differently depending on who was coming. Once he looked at her and said, "It's strange, I can remember the dark more clearly than their faces." Amara nodded, knowing that memory had nothing to do with clarity. It had to do with survival. "You remember what hurt the most," she said gently. Elias thought for a moment and replied, "Maybe that's why I never forgot the light." It was the closest he had ever come to humor. Amara smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. In those moments, she realized Elias wasn't just telling her what happened. He was showing her why he had built a world where light meant safety, where brightness meant existence. Every bulb in his room wasn't just illumination, it was rebellion, proof that he had outlasted the darkness that once tried to erase him. That evening, as their quiet ritual came to an end, Elias seemed unusually tired. His breathing slowed, and his gaze softened. Amara stayed beside him, watching the flicker of the bedside lamp against his frail hands. He looked at her suddenly, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen. "They forgot I was there," he said again, almost to himself. Amara leaned closer, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You're not forgotten anymore." Elias blinked, uncertain. She tightened her grip on his hand and whispered, "You're not alone." The words hung in the air, not as comfort, but as truth. For the first time in decades, someone had entered the space between him and his fear and refused to leave. Elias closed his eyes, not in sleep but in something like surrender. Amara stayed there, her hand still on his, tears slipping silently down her face. The lights stayed on, as always, but that night for Elias, they no longer symbolized survival. They symbolized connection. And for Amara, they were no longer artificial. They were the reflection of a soul that, against all odds, had found someone to see it. Richard had never intended to stop in the hallway. He was walking toward his study late as usual, juggling 2 phones and half a dozen emails, when he heard voices from behind the slightly ajar door of his father's room. At first, he didn't even recognize the tone of Elias's voice. Soft, steady, full of something that sounded dangerously close to contentment. It was Amara's voice that grounded him. She was laughing gently at something Elias had said, and her warmth pulled him closer despite himself. He paused, one foot hovering mid-step, and leaned in just slightly, and then it happened. A phrase, simple but devastating. "Thank you, my light," Elias said. His voice trembled not from age, but from sincerity. Richard's throat tightened. The words echoed longer than they should have, filling more than just the hallway. He pulled back abruptly, retreating into his own thoughts. My light. He had never heard his father use that kind of affection, not even for his own mother. A strange ache bloomed in his chest. Jealousy? Guilt? He didn't know, but it burrowed deep, scratching at memories he'd chosen long ago to bury beneath meetings, mergers, and metrics. He found himself pacing in his office, unable to focus. The idea that Elias could offer something as tender as my light to someone else, a hired caretaker, stirred emotions he wasn't prepared to name. Had he ever given his father a reason to use those words with him? He told himself it was silly, that he had provided Elias with everything, comfort, staff, space. Wasn't that enough? He wasn't cruel. He paid for the best doctors, the best food, the best room. But something inside him pushed back now. Was presence ever part of that package, he wondered? That thought struck him harder than expected. For years he had treated his father as a fixture. Fragile, yes, but static. A man defined by silence, by quirk, by dependence. Richard had never thought to see Elias as someone who still wanted something from him. Maybe because acknowledging that meant recognizing how much he had denied. That night, for the first time in a long while, Richard didn't return to his screens. He sat with his thoughts, looping back to the moment he had heard his father speak those words, and how they hadn't been meant for him. The next morning, Richard confronted Amara. It wasn't calculated. It was raw, reactive. He found her in the kitchen, calmly pouring tea into a cup she often brought to Elias. "He called you his light," Richard said, trying to make it sound like a casual observation. But the weight behind the words betrayed him. Amara didn't blink. She turned to face him, expression neutral but steady. "Yes, he did," she said simply. Richard frowned. "Do you think that's appropriate? That he's becoming that attached?" She met his gaze now, not with defiance, but something firmer, truth. "He's not attached to me. He's attached to being seen." Richard didn't respond, unsure what she meant. Amara placed the teapot down with care. "Your father has lived years without anyone noticing who he is beyond his needs. I didn't do anything special, Mr. Langston. I just sat with him. I listened." Richard swallowed hard. "He never called me anything like that," he muttered. Amara's expression softened, but her voice didn't. "Your father doesn't need luxury. He needs presence." The words struck like a slap. Not violent, but jarring in their clarity. Richard didn't argue. He couldn't. Something inside him had shifted, and he knew it. That night, Richard hovered outside the door again, staring at the polished wood as if it were some sacred threshold. He had spent years walking past this door, never through it. He would send others, nurses, housekeepers, managers, always someone to check on Dad, but he had never checked in himself, not really. Now his hand reached for the doorknob hesitantly. As it turned, he felt absurdly like a child again, sneaking into a place he didn't belong. The room was softly lit, just as Elias preferred. The old man was already in bed, half asleep, the glow of the bedside lamp casting a warm hue over his tired face. Amara wasn't there tonight. She had given him space, perhaps on purpose. Elias didn't look up right away. Richard stepped inside and cleared his throat. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice unfamiliar even to himself. Elias blinked, slowly turning his head. For a moment there was no recognition. Then something flickered. "Richard?" The name sounded foreign on his lips. Richard nodded and approached the bed. "I thought I'd sit with you, just for a bit." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was new. It was necessary. They didn't speak much that night. Richard sat beside the bed in the same chair Amara usually used, unsure what to do with his hands, unsure how to be present. But being unsure was better than being absent. He watched his father breathe, watched the faint tremble in his fingers settle with time. Once or twice, Elias muttered something, half dream, half memory, and Richard listened, really listened. And as he sat there, he realized how much he had never known about the man who raised him. Not because Elias hadn't wanted to share, but because Richard had never asked, never paused long enough to wonder why the lights were always on, why silence was sometimes more painful than noise. Now, sitting there in the quiet, he felt the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. Not redemption, not yet, but recognition of a life, of a presence, of a father who had never stopped needing his son, even when his son had stopped seeing him. And so, the moment that had begun, the chapter returned. For the first time, Richard entered Elias's room at night and sat beside his bed. No agenda, no expectation, just presence, just a son, No longer a CEO, no longer too busy or too guarded, choosing to sit with the man who once carried his world in silence. The chair was the same, the light unchanged, but everything inside Richard had shifted. He didn't speak grand promises. He didn't apologize yet. That would come. But he stayed, and in that act alone, something long withered inside Elias seemed to exhale. A beginning had finally taken root. The luxury was still there, the estate, the comforts, the best of everything. But tonight, for the first time, Elias had what he truly needed: his son's presence. Elias had spent a lifetime becoming invisible. Now, for the first time in years, he began to feel seen. Not just managed, not just cared for out of obligation, but truly seen. It was subtle at first, the way Amara lingered a bit longer when he spoke, the way Richard began showing up without being summoned. These weren't grand gestures. There were no long apologies, no sweeping monologues. But Elias had never needed grand things. He needed moments, and now they were happening. He began to anticipate Amara's knock in the evening, even adjust the pillows for her before she came in. Richard, too, though awkward, started sitting at the edge of the bed at night, sometimes with a book he didn't really read, sometimes with nothing at all. For Elias, their presence was its own kind of language. One night, after a particularly quiet stretch, Elias looked at them both and said, "I don't feel like a ghost when you're here." Neither of them replied right away. They didn't need to. A glance between them, a breath shared, was enough. That night, for the first time in decades, Elias fell asleep not just with light, but with trust. Trust, however, is fragile, especially when broken for as long as it had been in Elias's life. His comfort had become dependent not just on the presence of light, but on the presence of someone willing to witness him. So when Amara missed an evening, delayed by car trouble, he grew visibly anxious. Richard, to his credit, stepped in immediately. He came earlier than usual, sat closer than he normally did, but Elias paced near the window, his fingers tapping against the sill in that familiar rhythmic pattern. "She said she'd be here," he muttered. Richard stood up. "She's on her way, Dad. I promise." Elias didn't answer. Richard stepped forward again. "Can I sit with you until she arrives?" The offer hung in the air like a fragile olive branch. Elias hesitated, then nodded, not quite making eye contact. As Richard settled beside him, Elias whispered, "If the light stays on." Richard smiled gently. "Of course." That evening something shifted between them. Richard's presence was no longer just tolerated, it was wanted, however quietly. Over the next several nights, the routine evolved. Elias would expect both of them, though he never said so directly. When Amara came, he greeted her with a slight smile, and when Richard followed, he no longer flinched at the creak of the door. Conversations began to fill the space. Not always deep ones, sometimes just remarks about the day, small memories, or questions about what time it was, but they mattered. Every word chipped away at years of accumulated silence. One evening, Richard asked, "Do you ever think about leaving the light off?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was curious, gentle. Elias turned to him, his expression unreadable. "I think about what happens if I do," he answered. "And?" Amara leaned in now, sensing the weight of his response. Elias looked at them both and said, "I worry I'll vanish again, like before." Amara reached for his hand. Richard didn't speak, but he didn't look away. Elias sighed, not in fear, but in exhaustion. "But maybe not all the lights." His voice cracked at the end. Amara and Richard exchanged a glance, neither moving too quickly. The offer was not to be rushed. And then the moment came. One quiet evening, Amara prepared Elias for bed like usual. Richard was already in the chair, book open but ignored. Elias settled under the blanket, adjusting it with deliberate care. After a moment of silence, he spoke. "Can I try something?" he asked. They both turned to him. He looked at the row of lamps, then back at them. One light, he said slowly. Just one, but only if you stay. His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed a deep vulnerability. Richard nodded immediately. I'll be here all night if you want. Amara squeezed his shoulder gently. So will I. Elias pointed to the far corner lamp. That one can go. Amara rose quietly and crossed the room. When the switch clicked and the bulb dimmed into darkness, Elias didn't flinch. He watched the corner for a few seconds, then turned back to them. Okay, he whispered. It wasn't just a concession. It was a declaration of progress, of bravery, of a lifetime of fear being negotiated, one bulb at a time. That night, they didn't leave. Richard pulled a second chair closer. Amara sat on the edge of the bed. No one said much, but the silence was no longer oppressive. It was filled with presence, the exact thing Elias had been starved of for so long. Eventually, his breathing evened out, his face relaxed, and he slipped into sleep. Richard stayed up, staring at his father, wondering how many years they had lost, how many they still had. Amara rested her head against the bedpost, her thoughts drifting between heartbreak and hope. They didn't talk about the light again that night. It didn't need to be discussed. It had already spoken for itself. It was no longer the symbol of terror Elias had once known. Now it marked the space where fear met trust, and where that trust was finally being honored. And though the room was still partially illuminated, the brightest thing there wasn't the lamp. It was the bond slowly building among three people who had once stood on opposite sides of silence. And so the moment returned, simple but monumental. Elias allowed one light to be turned off, but only with one condition, but only if you promised to stay. And they did. Night after night they stayed, until light and presence no longer needed conditions, until the light was no longer a guard against fear, but a quiet witness to healing. The transformation of the mansion was not sudden, but it was undeniable. What was once a place of sterile silence and cold routines had become something else entirely, a home. The shift wasn't due to renovations or new decor. It came from laughter echoing from a room that used to be shut tight, from conversations once unimaginable, now drifting down hallways, from the weight of loneliness being quietly lifted one visit at a time. Richard no longer hid behind emails and conference calls during the evenings. Amara's shift didn't end at 8 anymore, not because she was obligated, but because she wanted to stay. Even the staff noticed. "He seems lighter," the gardener remarked one morning. "Your father," he clarified when Richard raised a brow. And he was. Elias still had his habits, still clung to his routines, but he no longer seemed haunted by them. His eyes, once always darting toward shadows, now lingered on faces. When asked by Amara if he felt safer, he answered, "Not safe." Held, a word that neither she nor Richard had expected, but both understood completely. And in that quiet acknowledgement, something permanent began to take root in all of them. Richard's journey had started with guilt, but it did not end there. Guilt can spark change, but it cannot sustain it. What carried him forward was something deeper, a growing comprehension of what love looks like when it isn't transactional. He began to understand that all the money in the world couldn't compensate for absence. You could install security systems, buy the best beds, keep the pantry full, but none of it mattered if the person you were caring for still went to sleep feeling alone. One night, while brushing his teeth in the guest room that had unofficially become his own, Richard remembered something Elias used to say when he was young. "It's not the house that protects you, it's who stays awake when you sleep." At the time, he thought it was nonsense. Now it made sense in a way that hurt and healed all at once. He made a habit of sitting beside Elias every night, sometimes talking, sometimes just reading aloud. No longer out of obligation, simply because he wanted to be there. Because he understood now that presence isn't a burden, it's a gift. When Elias had waited his whole life to receive, Amara too felt the change. She had come into this job as a caretaker, but stayed as something much more. Her bond with Elias had not weakened with Richard's involvement. It had deepened. She and Richard began to operate in quiet synchronicity, trading moments, exchanging looks, splitting unspoken responsibilities. There were times when Elias would lean more into Richard's side of the chair, and Amara would smile knowingly. It wasn't about competition. It was about healing being shared. One evening, after helping Elias into bed, Amara stayed behind and spoke to Richard in the hallway. "You know," she said, "he doesn't need two of us forever. Just one of you, fully." Richard nodded, not in dismissal but in agreement. "I'm getting there," he replied. And he was. That was the beauty of it. He was allowed to take time, and Elias was willing to give it, because every night that Richard showed up was one night closer to redemption. Not in the grand, cinematic way people imagine, but in the real, patient, humble way that counts more than most things in life. Elias, for his part, felt the change most profoundly, not because he suddenly became someone different, but because for the first time he didn't have to fight to be himself. The light by his bedside still stayed on every night. That hadn't changed, but it wasn't a desperate anchor anymore. It was a preference, a comfort, a choice. There were even nights when he allowed Richard to dim it slightly, just enough to soften the room. That small act said more than hours of conversation ever could. One night, Elias said quietly to his son, "I don't need the light because I'm scared anymore. I need it because I can see you better." Richard didn't reply right away. He just reached over and placed a hand on his father's. That's how it often went now. Fewer words, more meaning. Amara sometimes watched them from the doorway, quietly amazed at what patience and truth could repair. What once was a man surviving in shadows had become a man living in presence, not cured, but connected, not transformed, but revealed. Piece by piece, Elias had stitched himself back together in the company of those who finally saw him. What no one could deny anymore was that something sacred had been rebuilt in that house, and not with money, but with time. There were still quiet nights, still bad days. Healing is never linear, ever. But the loneliness that once filled the mansion's hallways had been replaced with voices, not loud or performative, but warm and consistent. Even the house itself seemed to have softened. Richard began inviting old friends over for dinner again. Amara helped coordinate a small birthday gathering for Elias, something no one thought he would allow. He did. He sat through it with gentle curiosity, even accepting a gift or two with trembling hands. But most telling of all was his expression afterward. "I think," he said to Richard later that night, "it felt safe." That word had become their shared language, the measure by which they all gauged success. Safe meant known, safe meant accepted. And Elias, for the first time in decades, felt both. Because now, when he opened his eyes at night, he didn't brace for darkness. He expected to see someone, and he always did. And so the chapter closed exactly where it began, but under new meaning. The mansion, once cold and distant, was now a place of laughter, conversation, and presence. Richard finally understood that caring wasn't about comfort or money. It was about being the light in someone else's darkness. Elias still slept with a light on, but not out of fear. It stayed on because he wanted it there, because he chose it. Because now, when he opened his eyes, he would find Amara or his son nearby, not out of duty, but out of love, firm, human, present, a light that in its quiet constancy would never go out again. Thanks for watching this story until the end. If it moved you even a little, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Save or Says, and leave a comment telling us what part touched you the most. And hey, if someone came to your mind while watching, send this video to them. Maybe this story says what they needed to hear today. See you in the next one.